Smithsonian, June 2016. I've lately fallen a little behind on doing these Smithsonian episodes. They don't really seem to be gaining very much attention, so I've been putting more effort into my fossil journal entries. But I'm still getting the Smithsonian magazines, and I'm still finding many of the articles to be quite interesting, so I'll keep doing this for a time, at least. The first article is a brief one about the beauty of Yosemite National Park. It talks about at the time, a 34-year-old man named Carlton Watkins, who traveled west along with many others during the California Gold Rush, and like them, like most stories, found little to nothing. The gold rush was abandoned within about 7 years, and after a while, Watkins set out to photograph Yosemite. And his were the first pictures to really bring Yosemite to national attention and admiration, even before Ansel Adams, who himself referred to Watkins as one of the greatest American photographers. Watkins' photos were displayed in a New York gallery in 1862, and 2 years later, Senator John Conness, a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, showed the photographs of Yosemite to Lincoln and to Congress. And during the time of the Civil War, Lincoln signed in a law to preserve Yosemite, the first federal act to do so. In fact, to protect a wilderness for common use and visit and admiration. Now, Yellowstone was the first wilderness to actually be established as a national park. In 1872, the preservation of Yosemite set the precedent for the creation of the national parks, and itself was named one in 1890. The second of any real length is titled Extreme Paleo, which talks about the body shape differences between Neanderthals and modern humans. Modern humans are our own 2,000-year-old species, sometimes called Cro-Magnon. I think they're the same, although I could be wrong. Anyway, it reads, while humans have barrel-shaped chests and narrow pelvises, Neanderthals had bell-shaped torsos with wide pelvises. They were also shorter and stockier. A previous hypothesis suspected that Neanderthals, adapted to colder climates than humans, required these larger chests and lungs to gather more oxygen. However, a greater capacity to draw in oxygen from the environment is needed when you have a population living at higher altitudes, not necessarily just colder conditions. The article goes on to hypothesize now that what Neanderthals actually needed the larger chests and pelvises for was to metabolize much greater amounts of meat and fat, very high protein levels, which is needed in colder environments. If you look at cultures, even today, those living in colder climates do have a much greater proportion of meat in their diets and that short, stocky build. Wild Irish Sage is about a gardener named Mary Reynolds who designs and sculpts gardens to resemble Irish landscapes. One of them, for example, is a moss-covered island shaped like a sleeping fairy. For her, fairies embody the spirit of the land, and she chooses plant, flower, and moss varieties that naturally grow together. I'm assuming this means that are native to the land that she's gardening in, and says she wants to eventually work up to manipulating forests. That's fascinating. Hacking the Amazon. Doesn't that sound odd? And it's another short one that mentions a study by the ecologist Jose Fragoso. The study being a survey of wildlife populations of 46,000 square kilometers and 9,600 indigenous peoples in southern Guyana, looking at forest cover and population dynamics that concludes that when modest amounts of forest is cleared for farmland, the ecosystem can survive without too much damage. The problem, of course, is that the rate of population growth and deforestation far exceeds any modest amount. And this is a problem I've been following since I was a young boy in the early 90s, you know, when kids go to visit museums and they have the simulation of how fast the rainforest is being cleared. So vast amounts of forest, rainforest is one of the most diverse and productive ecosystems on Earth, alongside tropical coral reefs, are cleared every year for farmland and human habitation. Now, let me make this point, and I think I brought it up before. Rainforest soil does not make good farmland. The reason is, even though you would look at the vast amounts of plant and animal life that the rainforest supports, you would think there is really rich soil. But the nutrients in the soil are so quickly reabsorbed by the plants and animals, the biomass is called, that almost none remains in the ground. And so when the trees are cleared for farmland, there's barely enough left in the soil to support the farm for even a couple years at best. So it really doesn't work, and then you have to clear more forest, and just escalating the problem with almost no real benefit to the humans at all. I mean, you get a couple of years of farming, and I know humans need to farm, but there's a finite amount of forest there. So we'll talk about this more in videos as we go on. Art of the Impossible is about a Bulgarian artist named Hristo Davutov, who was born in June of 1935 and studied art before fleeing the Soviet advance. He later arrived in Paris in 1958, where he met his wife when he painted her mother's portrait. It's an interesting introduction. At a time when the definition of art was still quite narrow, the early 60s, he began projects of painting and manipulating environments, giant projects such as wrapping museums in fabrics and painting fox storefronts, and became famous in doing so. The project mentioned this time is one called Floating Piers. The project uses nearly 250,000 polyethylene cubes, blow molded around the clock in 4 factories throughout northern Italy, to build this giant, what looks like a bridge, a pier, connecting the shore of Lake Iseo, which lies near the cities of Brescia and Bergamo, to islands at its center. "90,000 square meters of fabric in a saffron yellow hue, just floating on the water." The project is entirely funded by the sale of Hristo's earlier artworks. and was open to the public on June 18th of this year, 2016. The article does say a lot more about Christo and his projects, but it's rather jumbled and hard for me to say more here. Now we come to the article that the cover of the magazine advertises, the possibility of a world without mosquitoes. How so? Mosquitoes, or skeeters as they are sometimes nicknamed, are one of the most resilient and obnoxious animals on the planet. They are a type of fly, in fact, of the family Chilicidae, and it is the females of each species that do the biting for blood. And when they do this, they also pass on whatever they're carrying to the animal they are biting. The species that this article talks about is Anopheles gambii, often called the world's deadliest animal. It is a host species for the malaria parasite, a protozoan called Plasmodium falciparum. Now, according to the International Medical Corps fact sheet that I looked up today, every year malaria is the cause of 655,000 human deaths across the globe a year. And every minute, at least one child in Africa alone, that's just Africa, dies of malaria. So there is a molecular biologist named Andre Crisanti who has been seeking a way to eradicate malaria for over 30 years. And he states in the article that the best way to do so is to attack the mosquito rather than the parasite. The vector is the Achilles heel of the disease. If you go after the pathogen with drugs, all you're doing is generating resistance. Okay, makes sense, as microorganisms are insanely quick to adapt and evolve resistances to anything attacking them, primarily because they have such huge populations and such rapid reproductive rates. Insects do too, but in proportion to microbes, far less so. Scientists have figured out in recent times how to insert beneficial mutations, such as natural insecticides, into agricultural crops, so why not then create a mutation to insert into mosquitoes that would kill them? Seems plausible at first, but then again, insects have, as we said, quite the capacity to mutate and weed out defective genes themselves. At this point, the article goes into a very detailed description of the genetic science, which I'm going to try and condense here a bit. Genetic science isn't... I know a fair amount about it, but it's not one of my high strengths in science. And if I try to explain everything, I'm going to be going through it for much longer than I have the endurance to right now. One suggested approach was to create the lethal gene and then copy and insert it into both sides of the chromosome pair. You can see what a chromosome pair looks like here. So that when the pair is split for duplication, there's no chance that the gene won't be passed on. It's on both sides, whichever side is replicated has the gene. Another, developed in 2012 by researcher Jennifer Doudna and her colleagues, uses the process of a DNA editing enzyme to insert desired edits into a gene sequence, and in 2013 it was shown to be able to work to edit living cells. So, hypothetically, this could be used to edit a creature's genetics and potentially wipe out an entire species. For the eradication of a defect or disease is one thing, but Need I really explain the possibilities for biological warfare that this introduces? And here we come to the question encountered in genetic science before. Where do we draw the line on how it is used, or on who uses it? The latter probably being the even bigger question. As the article asks, if we can remake the biosphere to be what we want, how should we feel about that? I'll leave that for you to ponder over, and hey, discuss it below in the comments if you want to. Blood in the Clouds. That's an interesting title. It's about the battles of World War I that took place in the northern Italian mountains. Now, in 1915, Italy abandoned the alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany and joined up with the United Kingdom, France, and Russia. Russia, though, was in massive turmoil, at this time only 2 years away from the overthrowing of the empire. Italy was hoping to grab some pieces of Austrian territory, and the Italian front crossed harsh, rugged, bone-chilling mountains to do so. Soldiers had been crossing this terrain for a long time en route to invasions, but the mountains themselves had never before been the battlefield. The article follows the history and explorations of Joshua Brandon, Chris Simmons, and a researcher named Nicholas? I can't find either his first or last name, not sure which one it is that's given, who specialized in prehistory until becoming interested in World War I artifacts. Chris and Joshua both served as soldiers and gained a love of mountain climbing, and started looking at the battles in the Italian front with curiosity as to how the Italian troops possibly survived the cliffs and the cold. From May 1915 to July 1916, Austrian troops occupied a blade of rock on the mountainside called the Castelletto in order to deprive the Italians of a major supply route. In a battle, the Italians outnumbered the Austrians by as much as 10 or 20 to 1, and the 19-year-old commander named Hans Schieberger and his platoon were sent to sabotage the Italians' movement through the tunnels. They were told to hold the Castelletto at all costs, and after a year, the Italians blasted the rock to pieces, burying the Austrian army for a century under rock and ice. Climbing the mountains and glaciers, Nicholas, Chris, and Joshua have uncovered numerous skulls with holes and sometimes even bullets still inside them, and tattered uniforms with bones inside. They found buckets of food, letters to both to and from the soldiers' homes, helmets, mess kits, and even hand grenades. And many of the artifacts have been displayed at a contemporary art museum in the region, and the remains of 5,000 Italian and Austrian soldiers are now contained within a stone tower named the Pasubio Ossuary, pictured here. There's a very short article about Stokely Carmichael, a Howard University philosophy major who was a civil rights activist who began to diverge from the nonviolent civil rights campaigns led by Dr. Martin Luther King in the 1960s. He started becoming more and more of a socialist who wanted a unified socialist Africa, and moved very close to being a black supremacist. Was a Black Panther, and was using the message of Black Power. The pages, however, really don't go into detail into his motivations and what changed him, so there's little more to say. The next next article talks about archaeologist Sergio Gomez and his finding of a sinkhole at the base of the Temple of the Plumed Serpent, revealed by the rainstorms of 2003 in Teotihuacan, Mexico. In the language of the Aztecs, Teotihuacan means the place where men become gods. It was possibly settled as early as 400 BC and became a grand metropolis around 500 years later. Its builders are unknown as they predated the Aztecs. They have been suggested to possibly have been either people from the north who fled volcanic eruptions, or a tribe from the east known as the Totonacs. Whatever they were, they formed 3 pyramids at their new city core: the temples of the sun, moon, and plumed serpent named Quetzalcoatl by the Aztecs. The face of the temple of Quetzalcoatl has been observed to have been splashed with shells and waves, representing the initial creation of the universe from a watery void. Even now, in Central and South American mythologies, serpents are believed to be creator gods. Quoting the article directly, by AD 400, Teotihuacan had become the most powerful and influential city in the region. Residential neighborhoods sprang up in concentric circles around the city center, eventually comprising thousands of individual family dwellings that together may have housed 200,000 people. 200,000, yeah. The city, of course, and its people occasionally fell victim to civil wars, clashes with other city-states, floods and fires, and invasions. 700 years after its establishment, Teotihuacan was abandoned, leaving its treasures, fossils, and artifacts buried deep beneath its soil and in tunnels under the pyramids. Some of the treasures that Gomez has unearthed from under the Temple of the Plumed Serpent include seashells, cat bones, pottery, figurines, traces of mercury and pyrite, rings and necklaces, jaguar bones, balls of amber, and finely carved black statues, all laid out as if they'd been offerings, left by priests paying tribute to the creation of the universe, perhaps even Quetzalcoatl himself. As Gomez says, one could spend a whole career sifting through and evaluating the contents. Wildlife Warriors is about a team of ex-soldiers who have been fighting against Africa's out-of-control animal poachers. Following a brief period of hope and recovery in the 1990s and early 2000s, unrestrained animal slaughter exploded again in African countries. Last year, a protected lion named Cecil was killed in Zimbabwe by a trophy hunter from the United States. 3 years ago, in the Central African Republic, 26 forest elephants were slain by Sudanese ivory hunters, and more than 60% of Central Africa's elephant population has been lost between 2002 and 2012. Nir Kalran, a former Israeli commando who has made a career out of selling military expertise to conservation groups and game parks across Africa, is now using his tactics and connections to help protect the remaining elephants and other animals in the nearby Republic of Congo. A little later, Remy Pognanti, who had served French intelligence in Afghanistan and Mali, joined up, and in time, people from multiple origins and disciplines, analysts from the inner sanctum of Israeli intelligence, Arab and Somali speakers, many with simply an emotional stake in the work of conservation, joined up with the team, and they have formed an anti-poaching movement using military tactics and training. Now, Nir Kalran grew up in Yamni, a town on the coast of Israel. His maternal grandfather was a secret agent in the Shai, the precursor to the Institute of Intelligence in Israel, which oversees counter-terrorism movements and protecting Jewish communities, the Mossad. His father was a Navy pilot in the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, also known as the Yom Kippur War. As a boy, Calderon was known as a troublemaker, and now he and his team are still making trouble, but now for poachers. He decided to take a more militaristic approach than conservationist groups have usually been willing to do when he realized that the poachers they're attempting to deal with are waging a real war, with heavy assault weapons and resources sometimes even purchased from terrorist groups. Vast numbers of people, weapons, and resources, and it's somewhat of a case of fighting aggression or power with power and aggression. Critics of his methods, Calderon say he should focus on reducing the demand for animals and animal parts, bones and other body parts, throughout the world, but it's just too widespread and large a market. He wants to stop the bleeding, that is, the killing where it's taking place. And that's the last article of the magazine. If you happen to pick up this issue, the June 2016 Smithsonian, there are also a few rather interesting questions and answers on the very last page.